By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed.
If you live in the US or Europe, Africa through the media is only ever seen as a poor and unstable place with famines, civil wars, and large slums. Although this is the case for many of the 54 countries on the continent, this portrayal of an entire continent is on purpose. Not only does it give the countries a poor global image, it changes the way that we think about Africa as a whole, which will only ever slow down the efforts to develop its troubled nations. Africa is an extremely diverse place compared to Europe, with over twice the population and 25 times the native languages spoken. It's time that some clarity is given on the situation of many of its unstable countries if we are to understand why many of the countries are in terrible positions that we pity and look down upon. We have to see things from another perspective. One of the most influential groups of people in Africa since the first centuries has been the Europeans. The Romans, at the height of their empire, ruled over much of North Africa, leaving behind their architectural mark in places like Algeria, Tunisia, and modern-day Egypt. The continent would not see major European influences for over a millennia until the Portuguese began to discover sub-Saharan Africa in 1444, during the Age of Discovery. This would be the first of many journeys, as the Portuguese began to set up forts and settlements in West Africa, which increased trade and many shipping routes. The transatlantic slave trade was responsible for the forced migration of between 12 to 15 million people from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, from the middle of the 15th century to the end of the 19th century. The trafficking of Africans by major European countries during this period is sometimes referred to as the Great Disaster, or Maafa in Swahili. The slave trade not only led to the violent transportation overseas of millions of Africans, but also to the deaths of many millions more. A point is always raised that slavery in West Africa was always present, but this point misses a crucial factor: scale. Europeans throughout history are known for trading in the masses, and even though slavery did exist, it wasn't destroying the future of West Africa before the Europeans had arrived. Human resources are the most valuable resource that any country can possess, and the slave trade drained many of the kingdoms of that resource. The forced removal of up to 25 million people made Africa's population stagnate or even decline during the slave trade, historians believe. The Empire of Mali, before the transatlantic slave trade, was much larger than any European nation at the time and reputed to be one of the richest and most powerful states in the world. But the weakness of West Africa was its broad diversity that is still prevalent today. There was no unified West African identity that put into question the ethics of Africans trading other Africans to Europeans. The diversity, in my opinion, destroyed the kingdoms and empires of the time, as they saw more in commodities than uniting with their rivals against a plague that would change the future of the region. The slave trade would not be the end of the devastation for the people of Africa, as European imperialism set its eye on the annexation of the entire continent. The scramble for Africa would, for the most part, set Africa back socially and economically until the present day and for many decades in the future. A Congress of European governments met in Berlin in 1884 to carve up the entire continent between Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. In that conference room, there was no thought on how this expansion into Africa would affect the lives of 1.2 billion 133 years on. From badly drawn borders creating religious and cultural divides in African countries today, to genocides and concentration camps set up by the British and Germans, there was no room for empathy. Skipping forwards through more bloodshed and oppression to World War II and the weakening of imperial powers, African independence was inevitable. The new governments, however, were stuck with national boundaries set up decades before. If you look at a map of the conflicts along borders in the present day, you'll find that many of the countries in Africa are not satisfied with their borders, as they do not reflect the cultural borders like those carefully drawn in Europe. Mount Kilimanjaro is still claimed by the Kenyans, who were once ruled by the British, and the Tanzanians, who were once ruled by the Germans. Sudan ended up with Arabs and Africans placed in the same large country, leading to bloodshed for over 4 decades after its independence, and the Somalis ended up being distributed over 5 different countries. Democracies and liberal ideas took hundreds of years to be integrated in Western society, so it is no surprise that unorganized and corrupt governments are present on the continent. After the Second World War, West Germany and Japan worked closely with the Western countries to steer them to becoming stable democracies today.
But we cannot expect these people to discard Nazi ideas with the casual air with which they abandon their uniforms. Slowly, steadily, they must be taught the fundamentals of democracy. Our task is to supervise this training in democracy.
Germany and Japan are two of the world's largest economies, even after mass devastation all over Germany and 2 atomic bomb strikes on Japan, leaving both countries in complete chaos. The same treatment, however, was not given to the newly independent African countries during decolonization, and with very low literacy rates at the time, only a small population of newly formed countries were able to govern and manage an economy. We're likely to carry on seeing the same situations presented to us on the media for many decades to come, as we continue to supply monetary aid instead of diplomatic and social guidance. But that train has been and gone, and the fate of the continent has been utterly changed.